just to ask you about that, because you are a doctor. I mean, I know you're a psychologist, but when you look at
sort of like a doctor,
yeah, it's like a psychologist. I've said negative things about psychologists, but not per se the discipline, but not the person that my thing is whenever I talk to someone and I say, what are you majoring in college? And they say psychology, it's generally a person I'd never want any advice from. And that's anecdotal evidence. That's not backed up by any data. It's just like when I say, what are you majoring in? And someone says business. I go, I would never want to do business with you. It's just it's a very general thing that a lot of people major in, and a lot of people I feel like don't come out of that in a smart way. But as a doctor, what do you think about COVID? I mean, in psychologically, what it's done to people, the lockdowns, the fear. Obviously the fear of getting sick and then losing income. What is going to be the sum total effect, in your estimation, of this entire period on the psychology of the world and, more particularly this country? Like, we have a rash of shootings now that, we've always had, but now it seems like these numbers are high even for America. How do we come out of this, do you think?
Well, I mean, I've been struck positively in the main by how resilient our social structures and our economic structures have been in the face of this. I mean, we've been locked down in an unprecedented way for more than a year, and yet most businesses are still functioning, and the social order has been almost completely maintained. And with any luck, we're almost out of it. I mean, in the US, I think you guys are up to something like it's close to 35% of the population that's been inoculated now, and that should start to make a real difference really quick. We're a bit behind in Canada, partly because we don't make our own vaccines, and so we've been dependent on supplies from other countries. And so I guess to some degree, I'm surprised by our resilience in the face of this, social and economic. It's a remarkable thing that the vaccines were developed and distributed within the span of a year, that there's so many vaccines, that they seem to be working, that they're not producing catastrophic side effects. So I think that's all extraordinarily positive, all things considered. I think the signs of instability that are particularly evident in the US are attributable to factors other than COVID and the COVID lockdown that have been brewing for a long time, which I've been talking about, and many other people as well, for a long time.
Right. There are a rash of shootings that have been happening, school shootings. And one of my biggest disappointments is that all of these shootings are done primarily by men. And it feels like it's another thing that women have been kept out of, like, STEM. Is there a way?
That's a terrible joke.
It is a terrible joke. But, it's true. And so why are so many men being driven to violence?
Well, it's not so many. I mean, the school shooters are a tiny, tiny, infinitesimal percentage of the population. And so it's very difficult to formulate a policy to deal with such things because they are, in fact, so rare and so unpredictable. Aggression per se has its uses. Males are disproportionately violent compared to females, or at least with regards to physical violence. Females have their own particular brand of aggression, which has more to do with reputation destruction than physical violence. And that starts very early.
Yes.
You can detect that in children. And you have a very, very large country.
Right.
330 million people. It doesn't, one person in a million is pretty seriously disturbed. And so that's a shooting a day if it's one person in a million. And you don't have a shooting a day. So it's less than 1 in a million. So It's very, very rare. And thank God for that.
It is when you look at the numbers like that, but it does feel it's too much, right? I'm sure that, like, when we look at across the world at other countries that don't have these things, is any of this attributable to the fact that men now, and women as well too, but since we're on the topic of men, are retreating more into the digital world, that they are less socialized, that they are more into, potentially, not to blame video games, but like people seem to be retreating from the types of social structures that men had participated in for years, which was marriage, family, owning property, things like that. And it seems like a lot of men are not doing those things, or doing those things much later in life. And there seems to be, and you've addressed this, I think, as effectively as anyone, there seems to be a tendency of those men that are not participating in those social structures to feel alienated and disenfranchised. And that often leads to, negative pathologies. How do you encourage the type of social commitments that point men in the right direction? And I think you're a big proponent of the, more traditional way of life, where it's, forming a bond with someone, getting married, trying to, create and manifest the life you want. That's a lot of the things that you've read and you've talked about involve that. Do you see the digital sphere as being a real problem here, because people can escape into that?
I don't see the digital sphere as a problem, not as such. I think pornography might be a problem.
Well, that's the digital sphere.
Fair enough, but you'd have to decompose the digital sphere into its various aspects and then look at each of them. As I said, I think that the ease of access of pornography and its proliferation, I think that's not a good thing. I think there are many good things about the digital sphere. I mean, there are large communities of encouragement that have popped up on YouTube. I suppose I am at the head of one, but there are many people doing similar things, like Jocko Willink is a good example. And your question was, I guess, two-part. You commented that there's perhaps a disproportionate number of people who are feeling alienated from the general community, from life itself, from the social world, from the natural world for that matter, and that alienated, isolated, and lonely existence can lead to bitterness, and God only knows where that goes, right? That can move in an aggressive direction quite quickly. Well, the antidote to that, as far as I'm concerned, is something like encouragement. It's partly why I'm so appalled by the characterization of our society as essentially as both symbolically and literally as a tyrannical patriarchy. That the criticism that emerges on the left is essentially that hierarchies are predicated on power, and power is equated to tyranny, and then so social structure itself is equated to tyranny, and that's nonsensical. It's a nonsensical oversimplification. The fundamental ruling principle of a functioning hierarchy is not power. It's something more like fatherhood. It's something more like encouragement and reciprocity and reciprocity and courage and productivity and generosity, all of those things. And I was talking to Jocko Willink a couple of weeks ago, and he's a very assertive and man, very much capable of physical aggression, built for it, and both physically and temperamentally. And he went through the Naval SEAL training, and that's a prime example of a patriarchal hierarchy, let's say.
Sure.
But what they were taught most fundamentally was that each of them had their buddy's back.
Right.
Like they were taught reciprocity.
Right.
So and functional hierarchy.
Part of my generation's issue with that characterization, and I've listened to a lot of your work on hierarchies, and I agree with a great deal of it, but part of it is when we see so many of the institutions that we grew up with, the Catholic Church, the government. We look at a lot of the wars that we've been in that we now find out were foolhardy, and the reasons we got into them were not initially the reasons we were told. When we look at mega corporations and the things that they get away with, whether it's these massive fraud, examples of fraud. When we look at the dishonesty that is inherently, seemingly baked into not only the system but human beings, as you say, it's not necessarily capitalism; it's deeper than that. But when you say that hierarchies are more fatherhood or based on generosity or cooperation, my generation is looking at so many of the institutions that we have seen literally have been rotted out from dishonest, malevolent, bad actors and bad forces that seemingly are not really checked and seem to run amok and are not counterbalanced by that generosity or that encouragement that you talk about. So that seems to be, when I hear a lot of what you talk about, so much of it resonates with me, but some of it is hard to grasp because it is very positive and very hopeful view of hierarchies. But in light of all of the nefarious people and their ability to poison organizations, do you not ever look at some of those statements about hierarchies and say that, like, yes, hierarchies can get poisoned?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, there are a couple of observations there. When hierarchies degenerate, it's because of power and deceit. And they do degenerate. And a degenerative hierarchy is full of lies and power games. But I'm not characterizing hierarchies as based on, let's say, productivity and reciprocity. I'm characterizing functional hierarchies as characterized by productivity and reciprocity. See, the essential claim on the radical left is that the hierarchical structure per se is tyrannical and predicated on power. And that's simply not true. Now, when the structures degenerate, that's how they degenerate. And it's definitely the case that we have to keep our eyes open for that occurrence, that we should be appalled by it, and that we should strive to do everything we possibly can to stop it. But my sense of that is that starts with you. You want to stop deceit in the world, then stop lying. Right. If you want to stop the arbitrary exercise of power, then stop using it. Now, let me give you an example of this. I mean, because I'm sensitive to the criticisms that you just laid out and the reasons that young people might be cynical about the institutions, the institutions that make up our culture. And there's no doubt they have the proclivity to degenerate. As I talk about in chapter 11, that's the evil, that's the tyrannical king.
And I just before, because you're going to have a great answer for this. Yes. But like the other thing is when you say it starts with you, and to a degree that's true, but it's hard for a guy like me to believe. For example, when I was in community college, the CIA was running a labyrinth of secret prisons that we all later found out about. So it's hard for me to kind of make the connection. Well, if I do my homework, the CIA is going to stop running the torture prison. Like, that's the disconnect, I feel like, with some of the personal responsibility, that it does have a limit where it's like, I can be very honest. How is that going to stop incredibly powerful people?
How many people are we talking to, you and me, right now?
500,000 easily. Okay,
so, and you were in community college how long ago?
Good question. I was there I went back like a real loser, but I graduated high school in 2003. So let's say this was around 2004 or 5.
Okay, so it's 15 years, roughly speaking.
Yes.
Okay, so you've gone from that guy 15 years ago to someone who's speaking on a regular basis with 500,000 people.
That is correct.
So everything you say matters.
Well,
and you shaped your character back when you were in college. Look, you have power, plenty of it. And, people are watching you on YouTube, and they're watching how you say things and what you say and what questions you ask and all of that. And so you have more influence than you think. And now
flattery will get you everywhere. You are.
Well,
you're right about everything. I fold.
When you can talk to 500,000 people on a regular basis, then you have influence, and God only knows how much. And you're a comedian as well, and so you can say things that are funny, and funny things are often true. One of the characteristics of comedians is to say true things and that people don't expect, and everyone cracks up about it.
Some of them are true, and we'll see. Some of them we don't know that they're true at the time, and then months later, someone goes to jail and they are true. But
I've observed when institutions become corrupted that there's someone heading the show, generally speaking. There's individuals who are acting in a corrupt way. They're lying often and they're dominating inappropriately. And the reason I picked the individual as the focus of my attention was because I thought that was the place where the proclivity for the corruption of social organizations could be best
addressed.
That's where the best addressed. Well, how else could it possibly be addressed? With other institutions?
Right.
They're going to run into the same problem, aren't they?
That's a fair point.
So, you say there's limits to personal responsibility, and I suppose that's true, but it isn't obvious to me what those limits are. I mean, you climbed out from community college to the position of authority and influence that you have now, and God only knows what you'll be doing in 10 years, and God only knows what you could be doing in 10 years if you did everything right.
Right.
And so it isn't obvious to me at all what the limits of personal responsibility is, and I certainly believe that the spoken truth is absolutely unstoppable. And so the better you are at expressing...
I do agree with you, but we do have... it is a little stoppable because we are on a website right now that can choose to take me off anytime they want, right? I mean, we're using YouTube right now and they can take me off. And, we are on platforms that we monetize our show, but they can kick us off too. And then, so there are things that you do run up into, you hit walls, I think. And I think personal responsibility is great. I think it's important. I think it's essential for people to live good lives. But there's a lot of seemingly institutional injustice out there when it comes to the prison system in America, for example, and, private prisons, people making money, by giving kids harsher sentences in the penal system, and this has been a massive scandal. There was a documentary about it called Kids for Cash, where you have, corrupt people doing horrible things. And I'm not naive, and I don't think that you can ever eradicate anything like that. But I do feel like there is a tendency of people to say, well, I'm honest and I'm doing the right thing, but they don't hold any of those other people to account that may be doing horrible things to other people. So I think maybe...
Well, I'm definitely not suggesting ever that you stop with yourself.
Right.
You just start with yourself. It's if you look at any complex problem, you could say that it might manifest itself at multiple levels of social organization. The individual would be implicated, but then perhaps your family, perhaps your community, perhaps your whole country. You can stack up the hierarchies, the social organizations around any given problem, and then you could say, well, the problem could optimally be addressed at all of those levels of analysis simultaneously if you had the capacity. And that's the case. I would say that as you put your own life together and become more responsible and more capable and hopefully more generous and more honest, then you're going to be in much better position to properly assess what steps need to be taken in the broader social realm.
Right.
I've never suggested that people limit themselves to their room, let's say.
Right.
But for me, and this makes some sense because I am a clinical psychologist, the fundamental unit of analysis is the individual. And I would also say that's the principle upon which our culture is erected. That's the place, that's the fundamental place, is the individual. And maybe that's because individuals feel pain.
Right.
That's where the reality is, and the rest of it's abstraction. Not that it isn't important or relevant, it is.